Chapter 2: A Personal Journey. Like most people who had endured one or two wars with their indescribable horrors, or who had realized the hollowness of armchair idealism and platform speculations, both my wife and I were hungry for substantiation of many of the old statements, religious and philosophic, by personal experience. So it happened that one evening in 1954, my telephone rang, and the voice of a stranger told me of a mutual friend who had suggested we should meet each other. It seemed he thought we had many things in common. This is always an intriguing situation to follow up, which of course we did. We had indeed a great deal more in common than we at first expected. We were both deeply interested in metaphysical religion and philosophic outlook, and in India. Both were vegetarians, and strange to say, both had attended the same school, Berkhamsted, at the same time 50 years before. This new contact was with one Colonel C.W. Saunders, late of the Indian Army. For many years, my wife Anne and I had read with delight most of the contemporary and often over-romantic novels touching on the fringes of Eastern mystic life, such as Bengal Lancer, Garden of Vision, and Lost Horizon. We had always sensed the existence of an elusive but profound truth. But here was someone who had gone beyond the official army and a social way of life, and had immersed himself deeply in the very world we had so lovingly read about, but had never dared hope to experience personally. In spite of army duties, the colonel had been for some 18 years a disciple of a great guru, master or teacher, Maharaj Savan Singh of the Punjab, India. Indeed, he was a very devout pupil, for he had brought the philosophy of Sant Mat to England with his book, The Inner Voice. I personally have had many interesting psychic experiences, both in war and peace. Together and between us, my wife and I had explored many fascinating angles of thought. Madame Blavatsky with Mrs. Besant in Theosophy, Dr. Steiner, Krishnamurti, Uspensky, and others. For me, the search also included the ancient art of Freemasonry, which points out that the genuine esoteric knowledge and meaning of life has been lost by man's passions, yet can somehow, somewhere, be regained at a mysterious center. Had not the poet Milton, amongst many others, declared this? Footnote: a number of crusaders to the Holy Land were captured or otherwise detained in the Near East, and learned from wise men the meaning of inner transport, which had been lost to men, but which could be restored to them by a living master. This was the basis of Freemasonry and other esoteric bodies, most of which endeavored to translate these teachings into the Christian ethic. They then became immersed in ritual, thereby losing once more their essential, esoteric, and universal purpose. In its place, they substituted symbols and pageantry. End footnote. Always in these studies, our attention was directed towards the East. Here, at last, in Sant Mat, was a profound teaching, referring to that same central cortex, that was understandable and most inspiring, and that for me did not invalidate Christianity or other approaches. On the contrary, it coordinated and brightly illuminated them. Without formalities, without rituals, without officials, temples, or churches, and without difficult yogic postures or complicated breathing techniques, here was something that appeared both practical and transcendental. And it was offered with the greatest simplicity by a living master, a saint, a Satguru. How did we know, you may ask, that he was indeed a Satguru, a true master? The truth is, of course, that we did not. But we were invited to listen, to read, and to investigate the teaching thoroughly before arriving at conclusions. It was some months before the Master graciously accepted us as pupils. But those intervening months proved to be the culmination of our studies to date, and many fateful things followed, all pointing in one direction. My professional life came to a close, together with the end of my lease and the maturing of insurances, all practically inviting us to a new state of activity, so that wistfully expectant, we wrote for permission to visit India at the Radhaswami Satsang in the eastern Punjab. This small colony, which sits on the banks of the river Beas, where Alexander the Great ended his invasion eastward, with the Himalayas appearing in the distance, was soon to become to us much more than a dreamland or a Shangri-La. There are many significant sidelights to a search for truth. Like most seekers, I have often been expectantly asked for gifts of money or invited to join something with a subscription. On this occasion, the Master, called by some loving title such as Maharaji or Huzur or Satguruji, and who personally answers all letters from his vast following, replied much to our surprise that it was not necessary for us to travel so far or to bear so much expense. We could practice the teaching effectively wherever we found ourselves. If, however, we still wished to meet him personally, we would be most welcome. Naturally, we went post-haste, and in the course of many months and after many requests, we were allowed to pay a very modest contribution towards our food and servant only. Also, to our surprise and great comfort, arrangements were made by him for us to be met at airports and railway stations in India by his disciples, and finally to be escorted into his presence in the Radhaswami colony. This was a very different matter from the romantic novels. Our Master was so very real, and his work was concerned in a very practical way with souls, ours and those of others who sought him. He was not an intangible entity such as we had often heard of in mystic teachings, an ascetic hidden away in the impenetrable hills, whom no one ever contacted and whose work was vaguely mysterious. Our Master made mysticism a reality and working profundity. It would be impossible to know what impression we two spiritual babes in the woods made upon Maharaji at that meeting, but Anne and I both felt strangely at home, and yet were in some way embarrassed. But the Master has command of all situations, as we found out not only then, but also 1,000 times since. And he soon gave us our bearings, so much so that the projected short visit was prolonged into 8 months. They were months of joy when the Master was with us, but a strange lifelessness when he was away teaching elsewhere over the wide stretches of the Indian subcontinent. When he went to nearby villages to give satsang, a meeting with a discourse, we were often enough invited to accompany him in his car, and on one occasion, to stay with him at his ancestral farm in Sirkandarpur near Sirsa, some 200 miles to the south. Usually, there are a number of Western disciples visiting the Dera, or resting place, as the colony is called. But for part of our stay, we were the only 2, and were therefore especially privileged. During these 8 wonderful months, we were delighted to wear Indian dress, which is remarkably comfortable and appropriate in hot weather, to eat the excellent local food, and to live as nearly as possible in the Indian rhythm. We were fortunate to be without radio, television, telephone, or newspapers, all of which deprivation was replaced by close interchange with other satsangis, disciples of Sant Mat. Footnote: all these amenities are now available at the Dera. End footnote. At the times of the biggest gatherings, bandaras, which occurred 4 times yearly and lasted for several days of teaching and initiations, there would be anything up to 200,000 souls, in spite of the fact that the colony is about 25 miles from any city and 3 miles from a main road or rail. Footnote: Amritsar is about 25 miles away, Jalandhar 24 miles. End footnote. These vast audiences would include a generous cross-section of Indian life: princes, army officers, businessmen, and peasants, coming from all over India and speaking many languages. They were all fed without charge, served by voluntary help, working day and night. But I never really discovered how the colossal and seemingly impossible task was accomplished. Throughout these huge and colorful gatherings, there were never any police present and no incidents. In the normal life of all Indian spiritual centers and ashrams, there is a more or less continuous movement in and out of passing sadhus, sannyasis, yogis, and other mystics and holy men, and it is possible to contact many divergent views. At different times, there came 2 sannyasis, very learned and practiced in Raja Yoga, and fortunately for me, also well enough versed in English. One of them, the younger of the 2, was quite sure that he and I had met in the past, and my own feelings were reciprocal, for it was I who singled him out amongst a vast crowd. He was a remarkably dapper, well-groomed man, who obviously had not entirely renounced the world in spite of his orange robe. It seemed that he was prideful of his spiritual powers, and in many ways he indicated that he lived on the fat of the land. He told me after a few days at the colony that he was not impressed. He felt quite sure that the master had nothing to teach him, and he tried to convert me to Raja Yoga, of which Maharaj Charan Singh says in Light on Sant Mat, "Hatha Yoga, I may point out, is an excellent discipline for the body. Raja Yoga is better, but that too does not enable you to control the mind fully, nor does it finish your series of births and deaths, for the seeds of karma are not destroyed by that method. Surat Shabad Yoga enables you to roast the seeds of karmas, as it were, so that they cannot sprout again. Mind can only be fully controlled by a power which has its origin beyond the mind, and that is the divine sound." One morning, while Anne and I were walking on the riverbank, we passed him and a companion. I greeted him with our salutation of Radha Swami, which means Lord of the Soul. He replied with the sonorous Om, and I felt a strong emanation, like a small blast of wind. Then he passed along on his wanderings and beggings, and I knew him no more. But the other sannyasi, and older, I think wiser man, stayed to experience a different fate. He had been to England and knew the Lake District quite well, so we had some common ground. We had many talks, some serious and some light-hearted, on the riverbank and in the compound. When I had made real companionship with him, he confessed that he had heard of the master's teaching and had come armed with his yogic power to demand whatever it was the master had, and he had not. Strangely enough, he did not receive entry to the master's presence. Day after day for weeks, at first expectantly, and then doggedly, he waited outside the gates of the master's garden. Gradually, I saw the arrogance fade into perplexity, and then into downright humility. He begged a hot bath from our chowkidar, caretaker, the first, he said, for years. A few more days, and suddenly his air of dejection changed to one of joy and sparkle. He had been invited in, and had met and talked with Maharaji. He had changed into a pure white Punjabi suit, and the last we saw of him, he was setting out to earn his living, without his begging bowl. The master is not enamored of laziness or dilettantism. It is a rule that every disciple must earn his own livelihood, unless retired or disabled. Even many retired men are honored to be main supports in the work of the colony. At the time of our sojourn, there were a professor of languages, an ex-banker, 2 retired judges, a professor of agriculture, doctors of medicine, ex-teacher, and a minister of the church. All of our encounters in the colony made us focus on the spiritual side of life. When a few kindly friends in the West feeling that we were unduly isolated, forwarded bundles of newspapers. The shock of their seeming brashness and vulgarity, after the exercise in serenity, was so great that we felt impelled to dispose of them, which we did. This may sound smug, but it was a very sincere and natural reaction. This is not to suggest that all India is saintly. Far from it. The mysterious East is becoming speeded up to its material benefit. The 20th century has even obtruded itself on the colony, which has lately been obliged by the new tax and land laws of India to form itself into a society in order to maintain and develop sufficient land for its growing requirements. But there are still a few of the old caves for meditation high up in the river banks, so carefully tended and so clean, that had fascinated one Western disciple so much he ordered one to be made for himself. It is altogether an unforgettable experience to divest oneself of ruthless materialism and truly live for a while. But even so, as the Master points out, you take the same mind with you, and in that atmosphere of transcendental thought and example, one's own personal eccentricities and fallibilities stand up very much to attention, to be inspected and, if possible, suitably dealt with. This is not always an agreeable experience. Indeed, it can be, in many ways, quite distressing, but it is extremely salutary. And after all, that was why we had come all those thousands of miles. Long ago, Shakespeare wrote these well-known words in Julius Caesar: "There is a tide in the affairs of men, which taken at the flood leads on to fortune. Omitted, all the voyage of their life is bound in shallows and in miseries." And now we realized that certainly our affairs were at the flood. Here at last was the Master of our search. But how can I speak rationally of the Master? Like everyone else, we were familiar with masters who teach in schools. Like theosophists and hosts of other students, we were familiar with the idea of masters in the sense of perfected men, but to us they were vague astral or transcendental ideals whom one never saw nor met, and who were said to meet together at full moon, deep in the Himalaya mountains. But here, in Beas, was a master of the transcendental, not merely a teacher, but a realized soul, a perfect adept, a Satguru, a saint with a vital spiritual technique for all, and with awe-inspiring wisdom and conduct. The traditional Christian concept of a canonized saint differs from the sainthood referred to in Saint Mat. He or she is one who led a markedly saintly life, who performed miracles, or at whose grave or habitat miraculous phenomena have occurred. Both in the East and West, such terms as saint and holy man are freely and loosely used, but in the Sant Mat context, a saint or Satguru is one whose consciousness is equally at home throughout the several great regions of the universe, from matter to spirit, up to Sachkhand, the true heaven and our original home. He is free to come and go at will throughout these regions. A Sant Mat saint may be a teacher who lovingly initiates disciples and trains them to turn inwards. Thenceforth, he never leaves them. He is with them throughout life, at the time of death, and on the long spiritual journey through those same regions that he knows so well. It would be foolish of me to attempt here any description of such a one as the Master at Beas. To his disciples, it would be entirely inadequate, and to others it would seem to be over-fulsome or even extravagantly imaginative. His house is simple, but is furnished tastefully throughout, and is redolent with spiritual delight. His garden likewise is aromatic with jasmine, orange, and rose, with a deep, all-pervading tranquility. this notwithstanding the constant coming and going of seekers and disciples, and the special occasions that are generously frequent. The gateway of the garden, when we were there, was presided over by a most saintly sadhu with purest white beard and turban. The satsangs, or discourses, were naturally in the local tongue, Punjabi, and non-Indian devotees, whose numbers were small at the time, were usually invited to the master's house in the evening to be instructed in English. So many unusual things happen in and around Maharaji's residence. One small but very recurrent thing, for instance, almost everyone we knew had many questions to ask, but rarely were they put, because they all seemed to fade away, and the answers became self-apparent, even perhaps while walking to his house. This feeling of inner communication with the master seemed to be so natural as to scarcely raise comment, except from a newcomer. There is always a mass of work, seva, to be done in and around the colony, which is rapidly developing and enlarging its amenities, and the satsangis, visitors, and residents alike voluntarily band together by the thousands to do it, no matter what its nature. The results are truly astonishing. In the recovery of this one-time jungle land along the riverbanks, which have been torn into small ravines by flooding river torrents, hills are literally moved by hand, and the crevices filled up with them. Not by modern expensive engineering, but by the basketful. Soil, bricks, anything can be seen being transported in these baskets upon the heads of thousands of devoted followers in endless ant-like movement. This seva is treated by them, who may include all ranks of society and castes, and some Western followers, as a spontaneous, loving, and enjoyable offering to the Satguru. It is a physically dirty but spiritually cleansing experience in humility. Maharaji invariably goes to scan these activities, and the smiling faces light up even more with joy as he approaches. It is indeed a light-hearted operation from beginning to end, and one is staggered by what he observes. Indeed, the quality of all-pervading love is the keynote of the teachings of the saints, and the Master himself, as might be expected, is an outstanding example of love. He radiates it at all times. Those in his vicinity are keenly aware of it. Those in far distant places are also kept aware of it in stressful times, such as illness, accidents, and even death, as well as in meditation. Almost every satsangi has some heartwarming and dramatic story to tell of the Master's grace. The recounting of miracles, however, is not encouraged in Sant Mat, for the teaching is that true faith must be founded upon personal inner experience, upon a deep and lasting love for the Lord, and not upon proof by phenomena and miracles. One can be so easily misled by these things, which are not in themselves the hallmark of a saint. Many yogis can perform miraculous things, and many yogis are not saints. The wisdom of this caution can be clearly seen after a little study of Sant Mat. Nevertheless, there are countless authentic and wonderful stories of the Master's instant help in times of grave difficulty, as in the Quetta earthquake, as in the dreadful days of the partition of India, when many thousands of lives were saved, and even as in our own small personal circles, at home and abroad. Indeed, one of the delights of the social life in the colony is listening to stories of love and devotion to the Master, and of his reciprocal grace, many of which have been enacted before one's own eyes. One such incident, experienced personally by the author, is related as the epilogue to this book. At Christmas time, the Master, who respects all religions, invited his Western guests to a simple but delightful lunch in his own house. The master never interferes with or disparages the religious tenets of newcomers or seekers, for these tenets have helped and nurtured their faith so far. Rather, he seeks to show them the deeper truths of their own upbringing. He will, however, often rescue and enlighten a soul that, like a pot-bound plant, is urgently seeking room to expand and grow to fulfillment. The pot-bound soul is often stifled by too much intellectualism, rituals, and theology, be it Christian, Muslim, Buddhist, or any other denomination. But Saint Mate, the teaching of all true saints, will enlighten the inner meaning of all creeds, and is the way of fulfillment of all creeds. A seeker will then see why the statement is sometimes made that all religions are the same. They are not, of course, far from it. One can see in the teachings of the great saints of all ages their universal and lofty purport. But after their passing, their various loving or warring followers start religious sects to perpetuate their own interpretation of a saint's teaching. But of the purpose of the saints themselves, Maharaj Charan Singh says in Light on Saint Mate, "Saints are men of God who come here on a mission of mercy to lead suffering humanity back to the feet of God. That is their only mission in life. The source of peace is in you yourself, but there must be someone to guide you to it, and for that, a living master is needed. The treasure is buried within you, and you must have a chart and a guide in order to dig it out and utilize it for yourself. It is kept for you and is always there, but that unerring power sees to it that you get it only when you can properly utilize it."